The news and opinions expressed on Occupy Radio may not necessarily reflect the views of KWVA Eugene, the University of Oregon, or the Associated Students of the University of Oregon.
From KWVA in Eugene and the Occupy Eugene Media Group, this is Occupy Radio, an extended conversation about the issues which gave rise to the Occupy movement. I'm your host, David Getchy, Sierralupe.
There absolutely is a relationship between elevating corporate interests and corporate rights and the suppression of worker rights and human rights for the vast majority of people who are employed in these corporations.
Immediately after the 2010 Citizens United ruling, author Jeff Clements published a series of predictions about the decision's impact. 3 years later, his projections have come true. This week on Occupy Radio, we interview Clements about the updates to his book, Corporations Are Not People, and one thing he didn't foresee: the widespread, determined citizen opposition to corporate personhood.
Howdy, occupiers, and welcome to Occupy Radio. I'm David Getchy, Sierralupe, but you can all call me Getch, and I'm here with Rivera's son, who is back from the James Lawson Institute, and her head full of new, nonviolent ideas, and probably even more than the usual love for all of humanity. Welcome back, Rivera.
Thanks, Getch. It was a really amazing 8 days of intensive studying and learning. We literally started at 8:30 or 9 every morning and didn't finish till 8:30 or 9 every night. And there were 50 activists and organizers from around North America, as well as about a good 10 presenters from the North American continent. And wow, there is so much knowledge here just waiting to be tapped into.
It looked like a pretty big class you were involved with. A lot of people, good age range, all kinds of folks from those pictures I saw on Facebook.
Yeah, we had quite a variety of issues and projects and endeavors being represented, everything from the New Economy Coalition, which is focusing on parallel institutions, to the Dreamers, which is actually a couple of immigrants' rights organizations who came together, about 6 of them, to present and to learn. It was very inspiring to meet them. We also had Kai Newkirk and at least 2 other people who were on the 99 Rises March for Democracy in California.
99 Rise gets a nod from Jeff Clements in our interview today about fighting back against corporate personhood and the good work they did after they did their 500-mile march, which we documented.
That's right, and it was very exciting to meet not just Kai, but other people we had interviewed on Occupy Radio, including Philippe Duhamel, and to hear a lot more about what's going on in Quebec, about their creative, strategic civil resistance campaigns to stop fracking in that area. And also, Philippe has been at this work for a long time, and he did share a very amazing rapid-fire slideshow of various humorous arrests that happened during his career, I guess you could say, in civil resistance. And that was one thing that was very amazing, is just the scope of knowledge that came from the presenters. We had Erica Chenoweth there, who I hope we will get on the show one of these days, and she did several quite amazing presentations, but what was also equally amazing is what a heartfelt and sincere and incredible human being she is. I was really quite blown away by her presence.
I have to assume that, given that she is so well known for the book that documents the effectiveness of nonviolent organizing, and yet she started doing that studying to prove that nonviolent organizing isn't effective.
Yeah, she actually her background was in studying violent conflicts and how can civilian casualties be minimized in the context of those, and actually attended just a lecture on nonviolence and felt like the claims were so outrageous that she had to go and research it to disprove the outrageous claims, and found out that actually the claims might have even been understated. But I think it's just a powerful thing to have a person who is such an excellent researcher come with a skeptical mind and do the proofs and do the studies and look at the data sets. We all in the field have gained a tremendous resource, because I think there's quite a number of us like me who are not terribly great at studying data sets. So it's great when someone like Erica comes along and does that. She's also inspiring teams of other researchers to do more empirical data studies on nonviolent struggle, and I think that's one of the most beautiful things about her, is that she's tremendously inspiring and encouraging to people who want to study this field.
Now, I'm curious, you were all meeting and discussing nonviolence organizing all through the Ferguson crisis. How did that affect your discussions?
It was a very powerful theme that was running through it, and we did have a few of our participants go to Ferguson and come back with a ground report of just seeing what was happening, and that was very interesting and fascinating. I think one of the biggest things is learning how can we help communities, and the sort of take-home message that I took out of the whole week with the undertone of Ferguson going on is that if we can really study our field of strategic nonviolence and really work in our communities to build up communities that understand how this works and understand how to use it, so we're not always reacting to situations, but actually initiating the struggle in ways that do not escalate the serious problems that we're facing in this nation. So, it was a very emotional theme, very personal to some of the people in the Institute, and I think many of us were challenged to keep our calm amidst that storm and really see how to analyze dynamic situations that are unfolding rapidly, like Ferguson, with a clear mind, as one of the things that we bring to our movements.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about that in the future. But I guess right now, let's get over to Jeff Clements this week, talking about the movement to fight against corporate personhood.
Jeff Clements is an attorney who has worked on civil and environmental rights, consumer protection, and antitrust cases. He is the author of a book called Corporations Are Not People, The Definitive Guide to Overturning Citizens United, and also a co-founder of Free Speech for People, which is a national nonpartisan campaign to overturn Citizens United.
Thank you, Jeff, for coming on Occupy Radio this week with Rivera and I, touching on an issue which is pretty much core to the Occupy movement, the concept of the personhood of corporations, and what we all feel is the lack thereof.
That's right, and I'm really glad to be here, Getch, with both you and Rivera, and look forward to talking about that. It's a huge issue for Americans all over the country and people all over the world.
Well, Jeff, I know that you're involved in activism on this issue, but I want to start off with talking about your book, Corporations Are Not People, which has a revised and updated version of it coming out this year. Perhaps you could start with where did it start and how far have we come on this discussion of Corporations Are Not People in the interim between when it was first published and this new edition?
Yeah, it's been quite a ride. I did a brief in the Citizens United case as a lawyer for some public interest organizations, democracy organizations, and the case happened in 2010. And I wrote the first edition of Corporations Are Not People not long after that, 2011. And at the time, a lot of it was about how it happened, how we got to the Citizens United decision where the Supreme Court 5-4 ruled that essentially that the biggest global corporations are the same as people for political purposes, speech purposes, and could spend the kind of money we've now seen in politics. And I wanted to both understand that, how this has happened in our country, and then explain it. And so when I wrote the book initially, it was somewhat about the danger that I saw, that I think a lot of people saw, with this, what Justice Stevens in dissent called a radical departure from our Constitution. But a lot of it was sort of predictive. It was, this will be a problem. The huge money will flow in. Corporations will abuse our constitutional rights to strike down the public interest laws, environmental laws, and so forth. Well, now we know that's all true. Now we know, in the new edition, I'd love to talk about some of the data and some of the money. It's, I think, pretty shocking how quickly, and it's only just the beginning, but how quickly the absolutely devastating effect on democracy has been. So it has all that. That's the downside. There's an upside, though, too. The other thing that the first edition did was to try to outline some strategies that people could do to push back and win. Not just protest, that's important, but also to win democracy back. Again, now, after 2 or 3 years, we have some results coming in, and there's tremendously, I think, exciting and important developments that I talk about in the book about how much progress people have made across the country in pushing back, in taking back democracy, and I think eventually prevailing and overturning Citizens United, corporate rights, and restoring human rights and democracy here.
You're talking about things that people have done since Citizens United that are encouraging, and one of them was the bill that was passed in the California legislature to send an anti-Citizens United initiative to the ballot, which then got torpedoed by the California Supreme Court. I imagine you probably know something about that, Jeff.
Yeah, I sure do. This is a long struggle to win this, and the most recent chapter is in California. Just to sort of set the stage, let me explain the very first step. I see 3 steps we have to do, but the most important and urgent is to take back our Constitution, which is the basis for creating this corporate veto and elevating money over people in politics. And so we need a constitutional amendment. It would be the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. It would reverse the Citizens United decision. It would end the fabrication of corporate rights and restore the Constitution's underpinnings to, as it opens, we the people, not we the corporations. So,
except that corporations are people, so
well, until we win our constitutional amendment, and 16 states have enacted amendment resolutions calling for a constitutional amendment, including New Mexico and 15 other states. California, forced essentially by great organizing, really hard work, forced the legislature to put this on the ballot, a ballot initiative in November that would have called for California to condemn Citizens United and California politicians to get to work winning the 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution to reverse it. And they had 176,000 faxes going in to the State House to get that, tens of thousands of phone calls, 99 Rise, an exciting activist group led by Kai Newkirk and others, marched 500 miles from Los Angeles to Sacramento calling for this kind of reform. And so it went to the ballot, and as you say, Getch, just last week, the Supreme Court of California pulled it off the ballot, said, essentially denied the people of California a right to vote on this. Now that the fight isn't over, that case will go on. There's an effort to make sure it gets on the 2016 ballot. But again, this is a judiciary that is a little bit out of step, to say the least, with what Americans know we need to do to win back democracy. So that's where that stands, but there's a lot of effort, and nobody's going away. In fact, I think when people are told you're not allowed to vote on this, they get mad and they double down on the effort. So I think it'll just bring in more people doing this important work and increase the energy and the urgency of it.
I don't recall, Jeff, what was the justification for pulling that off the ballot? Do you remember?
Yeah, it turned on California law, so it's a little bit inside baseball because each state has a different initiative process. And again, to set the stage, we've been through this. In Montana, which had an interesting story in pushing back against Citizens United, they had a ballot initiative that we and others worked hard on in the November 2012 election. And it said the policy of Montana is corporations do not have the rights of people. They're creations of the state. And we set the rules for corporations, not the other way around. And the money isn't speech, money's property, and we, the people, have a right to ensure clean elections and accountable government by regulating money, and then called for the 28th Amendment and instructed Montana representatives and senators to get it done. That was challenged in court, too. And the challenges are usually around the state laws of the ballot initiative. We won that. It went on the ballot in Montana. Interestingly, Montana went for Mitt Romney for president by at least 10 points, but then approved this ballot initiative 75% to 25%. That's how strong this cross-partisan movement is. So in California, it got challenged legally as well under California law. And the theory of the California Supreme Court is that it's merely advisory, quote unquote, which means it doesn't actually change California law because it's calling for a federal constitutional amendment. There's a lot of lawyer arguments back and forth on whether California law means that, but that's what the Supreme Court of California said. That it's only advisory, therefore it can't be on the ballot.
Wow, that's interesting perspective. I bet that we, the people, strongly disagree with that notion. You know, I'm kind of curious, as you've been watching these struggles all over the U.S. and the different states, what is your perspective on the politicians' notions about Citizens United? I mean, I'm kind of skeptical. I think they're all kind of digging their heels in and rooting for the Citizens United decision, but that probably isn't quite as accurate as I think. So what have you seen in that spectrum?
I think it's complicated. I think what I've seen is politicians, as usual, have two ears. One is listening to what is incredibly popular or unpopular and trying not to get against it if it's incredibly popular. And frankly, Citizens United is hated and recognized for the danger that it is by huge majorities of Americans, and their politics don't matter. Poll after poll and vote after vote, like the one in Montana, showed 75-80% rejection of Citizens United. So it includes Republicans, it includes Democrats, it includes independents, it includes most people. So politicians don't want to publicly and get in front of that tidal wave. So they do different things. But they also, of course, have another ear that's very attuned to where the money's coming from. And so what Citizens United has accelerated is a systemic corruption of our politics. So even the best politicians are caught in this money game. So that's a problem. But what I've seen in the states that we've been in and in Congress are a lot of politicians now recognizing that there is widespread opposition to Citizens United and actually voting for constitutional amendment resolutions. Now, I have to say it's been harder in Washington to get the Republican inside the Beltway machine to go this way, and they've resisted reforms like disclosure. They've resisted the constitutional amendment resolution, but the amendment resolution has 50 senators co-sponsoring it right now. Unfortunately, they're all Democrats, and I say unfortunately because we need 2/3 of Congress eventually to win this. So we're going to need people of all different politics to get behind this. So there is support for this among politicians, and some of the votes in state houses in Maine, for example, we had Republican support, Democratic support, and independent support among the politicians for a constitutional amendment resolution. So many of them recognize the danger. Many of them actually don't want to be spending 75% of their time, begging for money from rich people and corporations. They actually don't necessarily want to do that. They have to do that right now. So I think we'll see continued support, and it'll be the usual. Some politicians will do it because they believe in it and they're good people. Others will do it because their constituents want it. Others will vote for it and hope it doesn't happen because they actually don't want it to happen, and they, as you say, are playing the Citizens United big money game. So it's a complicated picture.
Any thought about a constitutional convention to propose and pass the 28th Amendment?
Yeah, great question. And the short answer is yes, there is that discussion, and there are people working hard for that. And the context is Article 5 of the Constitution has two ways to amend it. One is by the 2/3 through Congress, and then it's ratified by 3/4 of the states. The other way is by Getch, as you're right, it's a constitutional convention can be called by the states, 2/3 of the states, I believe it is, and then it has to be, any amendment that comes out of that convention is then ratified by 3/4 of the states. So I think it was anticipated as you may need a convention if Congress just will not do what must be done. And so there are groups and people who believe that is where we are, and we need a constitutional convention. And so I don't think it matters so much now what the particular method of the constitutional amendment mechanism is used, as long as we all push together for the amendment. We haven't had a convention since Philadelphia in 1787, so we've had 27 amendments, including women's right to vote, ending the poll tax, overturning the Supreme Court when it struck down the income tax at the turn of the century, the right to vote amendments, many others, all were passed through Congress. So it doesn't mean that Congress is suddenly going to become effective or decent or not systemically corrupt. It means that this mechanism has always worked through history to be when the historical moment is right for that kind of a shift, and we push it hard enough to essentially make Congress do what needs to be done.
Jeff, let me ask you a question about the Democracy for All bill that is being proposed. I think that's the one that Udall from New Mexico, and I forget who the other major pusher through the...
Yeah,
is
that's
that right?
50 co-sponsors in the Senate. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, let me ask you a question that's been kind of plaguing me about that bill. It overturns or reverses the Citizens United decision and says corporations are not people, but then it puts the power to regulate how corporations interact with politics into the hands of Congress. I'm a little suspicious that that's a problem. What is your take on that?
Full disclosure, we helped write it. We worked with the Judiciary Committee, Tom Udall, and others on not only that, but also the People's Rights Amendment, which overturns the part of Citizens United that says corporations are the same as people. And that one says that the word person and people in the Constitution means human being. That's been introduced by Senator John Tester from Montana. So these are the two pieces. And you're right, the Democracy for All Amendment says that both Congress can regulate federal elections to decide what the rules are for spending, whether it's corporate, union, individual, and states have the right to regulate campaign spending. So the reason that was done that way is because that is the way I think democracy needs to work. I mean, there's no guarantee that Congress and the states will do it. There's no guarantee that they'll do it right. But it basically puts back into the hands of we the people through our elected representatives or the ballot initiative in some states to make the rules for spending in elections and to have public funding of elections instead of the privately funded politics that we now have. So it deliberately doesn't say what the answer is on exactly what kind of regulation or what kind of campaign financing or what kind of corporations we'll have. It puts that back. It takes that away from five ideological justices on the Supreme Court and puts it back into the hands of the people. But, we don't feel that the amendment and the Constitution is where you actually write the laws. It's where you sort of deal with big structural issues of rights and power. And so it returns the power to we the people. But, like all laws, we have to go through Congress or the states or the ballot initiative to make them. So that was the thinking, and I'm happy to talk more about it. There is another version. There's several different amendments pending in Congress. There's a lot of different ideas. The Democracy for All amendment that you mentioned, Rivera, is the one that has the most momentum. It's cleared the Senate Judiciary Committee. It has 50 votes already. It may have more. But there is another one that says that there shall be publicly funded elections, meaning that you could run for office and get either a number of small donors to trigger support from public money to run for office, or other kinds of mechanisms like that, so that anyone can run and voters will have a much wider choice. But there's different ideas. But as I said, the thinking behind the Democracy for All Amendment is it's really correcting a Supreme Court that stripped Congress and the states, and therefore we the people, of the right to even make those laws. We take that back, but there's still a lot of work to do to make the right laws.
Would the Supreme Court be in a position to just overrule Congress again should Congress pass a law like that?
It would be very difficult for the court to do that. I mean, that would be the gravest of constitutional crises if the court were to do that. And there's been never, well, I shouldn't say never. We've had grave constitutional crises in this country, and I'm sure we will again.
We currently have several,
but the amendment actually does change everything. I mean, the Supreme Court really is told very clearly, you were wrong, and
go back to your room.
We fixed it. Yeah, go back to your room. Stop with the aggressive corporate activism and just interpret the law. And the amendment is how the court would have to interpret the law. And the reason I'm confident the court will is they have before. So the Supreme Court's been overturned 7 times by constitutional amendments. The Supreme Court ruled that women don't have the right to vote, overturned. The Supreme Court struck down the income tax, as I mentioned, overturned. The Supreme Court said poll taxes are okay, overturned. And they didn't, after the amendment, just overrule Congress again. They took their guidance from the people.
And we'll be back talking with Jeff Clements about corporate personhood and how to overturn Citizens United after we take a quick break for a station ID and a special segment with one of our Occupy the Media favorites, Johnny King Dangers.
Okay, occupiers, Rivera is off learning all about nonviolent organizing and such. So we got lucky because we've got Johnny K. Dangers, who has been traveling the country and most recently attended the Idle No More Backbone Campaign Action Camp, which we will talk about in a moment. But first, howdy doody, Johnny.
Howdy, occupiers.
And thank you for coming in here into my humble Occupy Radio West studio.
I get to see the insides of the program.
Get to see the behind-the-scenes thing and just how humble a studio it is. We're going to talk about the Backbone Campaign, but let's talk first about your experience as an occupier. So you started in Occupy Phoenix, is that right?
Yeah, I started in Occupy Phoenix in October 2011. Came upon all of us quick and just came down to drop off some water and quickly got involved. Yeah,
Next thing you knew, you were an occupier.
I was an occupier.
All right. But that's taken you all over the country, though, right?
Yeah, I've traveled to Pasadena for the Occupy the Rose Bowl Parade, Washington, D.C. for Occupy Congress, the original national gathering, 4th of July in Philadelphia, and many things all over the place, meeting occupiers.
One well-traveled occupier and a familiar face to quite a few people all over the country, and now a familiar face for me. And also, somewhere along the way, we picked you up as a volunteer for Occupy the Media Collective as well. So thank you for all your good work with our social media and a lot of the fine tips you've given us along those lines.
It's been good working with all of the Occupy the Media Collective team.
All right. We want to make sure we get to the real meat of this conversation, and let's talk about the Backbone Campaign Action Camp.
Yeah, I went to the Idle No More Backbone Campaign Localize This Action Camp, which was on Vashon Island, which for people not from the Northwest is right outside Seattle, a ferry away.
Right across the Puget Sound?
Right across the sea. And that's the home of the Backbone Campaign in Bill Moyer.
So, Bill Moyer was on our show not too long ago. He was promoting the Backbone Campaign Action Camp back then, and you went and joined up. So what did you do out there? Who did you see? Tell us about that.
Well, this year was a little bit different. This is the 6th time they've had the camp on Vashon Island, but this is the first year it was an Idle No More
backbone campaign, localize this camp. So it was a collective effort between Sweetwater, Nanook, and Bill to create the camp and guide the vision for the camp. So there was a much different feel, a more spiritual feel to the camp, with a lot of indigenous voices being involved. Odin Lanning, who talked about the symbolism of a lot of indigenous art, and he created the T-shirt, the official design for the action at the end of the camp. And Paul Wagner was there with the Power of Ceremony, and we learned about canoes and several other indigenous speakers that it was a pleasure to see at the camp.
From the photos I've seen, you did a little bit of tree climbing. You did a little bit of workout on the sound. I guess that was Idle No More. Was there also a Greenpeace connection to that one, or was that just Idle No More when you're out there in the canoes?
I was in the kayak flotilla. We did a final action. It's called the Protect the Salish Sea action. At the final day of the camp, we kind of used all of our collective imaginations and planning and used all that we learned on the camp and had this big loving action to protect the Salish Sea. And part of that was we had a indigenous canoe across the Salish Sea with the kayak flotilla that I was a part of.
Okay, now what is the Salish Sea?
The Salish Sea is, for people not from the area, the water kind of all around the Seattle area in general. So
okay, I normally refer to that as the Puget Sound, but is that the Puget Sound, or is that a different?
If I remember right, it's the Puget Sound and then a few other bodies of water in the general area.
Okay, all right. And so now you were there for a week?
Yeah, a week. It was a week that went by extremely quickly. There was a lot of the different things that you could do when you were there.
What was an average day like?
Average day.
Was there an average day?
There was an average framework to the days, but each day was its own adventure. Average day, get a little bit of a wake-up call from the roosters. There were some roosters nearby, and I was staying in a teepee, and many people were camping in tents as well. Wake up. Every day we had amazing chefs, 3 of them, who made every meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, which was in itself a pleasure to see, because they took so much care into preparing it for everybody, vegans, carnivores, and everything in between.
You definitely have to cover all the ground in those type of things. How many people were they feeding every day?
It varied a lot. We started, first day I'd say had the least amount of people, and as each day went on, we had more and more people, and we had Friday, Saturday, Sunday, a lot of people by that point, and then the action on Monday. So
okay, now we just have a couple more seconds left. What would you say is your major memory of this whole experience?
My major memory, I'd say, was, starting a camp with a bunch of people you don't know. You know they're activists, they care about what they do, and over the week, growing as a group, growing as a person yourself, and learning all of these skills like tree climbing or kayaking and creative arts and all of these trainings, especially the indigenous trainings on spiritual activism and colonialization, and then seeing all of that come together at the end in a really powerful action that involved all of that ceremony and planning and everything you learned. We ended with a ceremonial canoeing and kayak flotilla over the Salish Sea and speakers talking, and we had lots of amazing artwork from the artists, banners and gifts that we handed out, all made over the week. And then we had a water blessing ceremony and a slow march along where the coal trains are, because that's what the entire action was about, is protecting the Salish Sea from the oil trains and the coal trains on the railroad. And we did that extremely powerful, slow march as a connected unit after that entire week, and then ended it off with a blockade of the rail, kind of bringing it to completion.
Okay, all right. We've been talking with Johnny K. Dangers, an occupier from all over the country who just attended the Idle No More Backbone Campaign Action Camp, and I imagine we'll be hearing more from you in the future. Thanks for coming on Occupy Radio today, Johnny.
Thanks for talking to you, Getch.
You're listening to Occupy Radio from KWVA Eugene and the Pacifica Radio Network, streaming at kwvaradio.org and podcasting at occupythemedia.podomatic.com. I'm your host, David Getchy, Sierralupe. We're back with Jeff Clements, author of Corporations Are Not People. We're revisiting the Powell Memo and talking about how we freed the slaves but unleashed the corporate beast. One of the things you were talking about before is when Citizens United was ruled in favor of the corporations, we could see in advance, all these bad things are going to happen, which is pretty much standard. When we started banging the drums for the Iraq War, I work construction, I remember talking amongst my fellow construction workers, and you can imagine that's not the most liberal class of people, and predicting, this is going to be a quagmire, this is going to be bad, all these bad things are going to happen, just as all of the left press was saying at the time, all these bad things are going to happen. We consistently can predict these bad things, and they always follow from these actions. But why can't the people who are passing these laws see these bad things?
Well, I've got a good book for you to read on that one. Corporations are not people. That's the question that really gnawed at me, and I'm afraid I have to report what to me is sad news, that some don't see this as bad. I've become convinced, and I think I tell the story, that these results that we're seeing and the disabling of democracy to those who took us down this road, that's not a flaw or a negative. That's what was intended. So, in the book, I talk about Lewis Powell. He was a Chamber of Commerce corporate lawyer. He was on the board of the Philip Morris Cigarette Corporation in 1970 and on the board of about 16 other corporations. And he wrote a secret memo to the Chamber of Commerce at the time. It's known as the Powell Memo. You may have heard of it, where he outlined essentially. Yeah, he outlined the plan. He said, corporations have to get much more aggressive. Democracy is kind of out of control. We're getting environmental laws after Earth Day. We're getting consumer protection laws. And he essentially prescribed a very aggressive, fully funded, long-term corporate effort to change the Constitution and change our democracy. He even said we need to use an activist-minded Supreme Court to drive social, legal, and economic change. Now, that alone would have been interesting, that, here's a corporate lawyer who's telling the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, how to organize corporations for that kind of thing. But he then went on the Supreme Court. Richard Nixon appointed him to the court. A year or two later, he goes on the Supreme Court, and he writes 4 decisions in about 8 years that created the idea of corporate speech, corporate speakers, and basically led the frameworks in a straight line to Citizens United. So from his perspective, the results we see where corporations have huge amounts of influence and the people have a lot less, that was part of the plan. You see it again after the McCutcheon decision, that when a millionaire coal engineering CEO, Sean McCutcheon, said his rights were violated because he could only give $147,000 each year to politicians who are running for federal offices. He said that violated his speech rights, even though that's about 5 times the median income for people. And he won. It was struck down. And there was outcry. There were protests in 100 cities. And the Manhattan Institute, one of the corporate-funded so-called foundations that Lewis Powell and the Chamber called for, immediately issued a statement saying, don't worry, rich people are better informed and represent the middle class anyway, so there's no problem if democracy kind of gets shifted to plutocracy and the wealthy govern. So there's increasingly just a unapologetic argument for plutocracy instead of democracy. And so that's what concerns me. That's why I think it's not necessarily enough to say, these horrible things are going to happen, billionaires and corporations will run our country.
So now you talk about, and everybody talks about, Jeff, the idea that the Powell memo really locked in corporate personhood, but it's my understanding that the concept of corporate personhood actually never originated from a Supreme Court ruling, number one, and it was really just a heading by a Supreme Court clerk that mentioned corporate personhood way back in the 1800s. Am I on the right track with that?
Yeah, I think you are. I think there's a really interesting story, and I talk a bit about it in my book, of really how the country has wrestled with the problem of concentrated power in corporations and other forms since the beginning. So there's been this sort of cycles, I think, of, corporations being used to concentrate economic and then political power. Leveraging that economic power into political power, and then pushback from democracy, from people, to balance it again. And so, the last time it was as bad, although I think we're worse off now, but the last time this happened before this was in the Gilded Age, when you had new concentrations of just previously unknown size of railroad corporations, and the oil corporations are just starting, and the mining corporations, so huge trusts and the concentrations of corporate power. And the Supreme Court was similarly corporatized as they are today. And there's a series of cases. The most famous, and the one you're referring to, Getch, I think, is the Santa Clara County versus Northern Pacific Railroad. And there, the railroad had challenged, this was about 1886, the railroad challenged state laws, in this case California laws, that taxed the railroad and said it violated the equal protection and due process rights of the railroad. And the equal protection clause and the due process clause, of course, are in the 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War, to guarantee equality of all persons, regardless of race. So the idea was, of course, equal human rights, but the corporation saw an opening and they said, it says equal rights for persons. We're persons too, and therefore we can't be taxed if the tax doesn't apply to everybody. And the Supreme Court essentially went along with that, and there's the fascinating history that I'd recommend for those who are interested in how that happened. It was put into a head note, as they say, the lawyers say. It's essentially a summary written by someone who's not even a justice on the court, more of a clerk. And that's where this sort of cryptic ruling that the corporations are persons under the 14th Amendment got inserted. As I said, I recommend Tom Hartman's book, Unequal Protection, that tells that story in depth. In the end, though, the court repeated it several times, and there's a series of cases from that time frame, and the court got as activist as it is today, striking down all kinds of laws based on this corporate rights theory at the turn of the century, the last century, and child labor laws even got struck down, worker safety and maximum hour laws got struck down under a theory of corporate rights, or what was called substantive due process, which is another way of saying essentially making up due process rights to reflect your economic assumptions and prejudices. But what happened, I think, was a lot of pushback. There's an amendment movement. There was action among lawyers. There was great democracy work. There were organized labor. There's a lot of pushback, and those cases essentially got swept aside after the New Deal and in the New Deal, and we returned, I think, to a much more balanced condition until Lewis Powell and the Chamber of Commerce came along.
And amazingly enough, then, corporate personhood, which is stripping people of a lot of rights just because we can't compete with corporations, comes from the amendment which basically freed the slaves.
Yeah, it's really, frankly, quite obscene when you think about it. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, if it gets worse, in that same time period is when the Supreme Court ruled that essentially women weren't persons. Women brought a right to vote action, saying equal protection of all persons means we can't be denied the vote anymore. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you can be denied the vote. So corporations had rights. The 14th Amendment had a sad history of, Jim Crow laws and segregation, and, it was widely ignored in the country. Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court essentially endorsed that, well, they became very aggressive in giving corporations rights under the 14th Amendment. A very sad chapter for the court and the country, I think.
But it is a reminder to us all that just because the Supreme Court says it's going to be this way doesn't mean that it is. And that we as citizens, using tools of nonviolent struggle and of organizing tactics and really, taking a stand for our own self-respect and pride, have a lot of power that actually resides in us. And it isn't necessarily electoral or judicial power, but it is a power of refusing our consent, our cooperation, our support of the business as usual, which is a very poignant phrase in this topic. I wanted to ask you, Jeff, a little bit about things that are coming up in your world. I heard you're going to go on a speaking tour with this book. Is that happening, and where are you headed?
Oh, it's definitely happening, and I'm looking forward to it. And I'll tell you a little bit about that, but I would like to just echo and endorse full-heartedly what you just said, because I don't want people to think, oh, this is just, constitutional law, or it's wonky, or it's for lawyers, or it's politics. It's everything. And I think that's what we've learned in this country when the Supreme Court sort of ratifies an unjust, wrong doctrine. The battle, the work becomes everything. It's cultural, it's legal, it's economic, it's basically all of our lives. We need to respond in whatever ways work for each person. And I think we've seen that with civil rights battles. We've seen it with women's equality. We've seen it with the environmental movement in the past. We've seen it with virtually every great step forward for our country and society as people respond to egregious injustice. So that's really important. And yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation around the country. I'm going to start in my hometown of Concord, Massachusetts, where the revolution, of course, against the British started too, in 1775. And then I'm going from there south, north, east, west, all over the place. I'll be in Kentucky and Arkansas and California and everywhere in between. And so you can see where and check in with me about an event on corporationsarenotpeople.com.
And I wanted to bounce back to an idea that you were expressing just a couple minutes ago about how after the Supreme Court trounced all the individual personhood concepts back in the late 1800s, they basically set up a clash over labor, I would think. If you look back in the early decades of the 1900s, that was a time of huge, violent labor struggles with, massacres going on. And that, to me, stems from the decision to grant corporations personhood and to strip away rights of the workers. And we're looking at a very similar atmosphere right now. What do you think? Can we turn it around before we get to repeating those same things as 100 years ago?
I certainly hope so. I think it's an important point. When the court says that it is illegal to organize as employees and then gives organized capital rights to suppress working people, you're going to have people not just accept that, and nor should they. It's wrong, it's not right, and it's not what our Constitution means. But that is exactly what happened, and it is what's happening now. The most recent case of corporate rights trumping human rights is the Hobby Lobby decision, so-called, the decision that says corporations now can claim freedom of religion under the Constitution to deny their employees access to legally mandated rights like access to birth control and health insurance that includes birth control. So Hobby Lobby is a corporation. It has 13,000 employees. The court didn't for a second inquire as to what their rights were, what interests they have. Instead, the corporation was held just this year to have a constitutional right to be exempt from mandated health care benefits, and therefore their employees are just out of luck because they work for that corporation. So we're seeing it over and over again. The court struck down a law that said that corporations need to post in the workplace notice of the workers' rights to talk about workplace conditions and organize if they chose to. That got struck down as a violation of the corporation's so-called right not to speak. So, there absolutely is a relationship between elevating corporate interests and corporate rights and the suppression of worker rights and human rights for the vast majority of people who are employed in these corporations. So I think the court does set up, unfortunately, these kind of unnecessary clashes. The fact is democracy should be deciding these issues. Democracy should be deciding the right balance between, the organized, concentrated capital and how it is deployed in the workplace. So I hope and trust that the work that's going on will result in overturning these decisions, restoring a much more effective democracy and, frankly, much more effective corporations. There's a lot of work being done about corporate reform that would make better corporations more effective, both as economic entities, better places to work, and better for society. So I think that and believe that we can find a new path that fixes the problem, leads to a better place without the kind of violent clashes that resulted the last time the court and corporations took us through this kind of chapter of corporate constitutional rights and corporate power dominating government.
We have a lot of tools and resources that are rooted in the nonviolent fields that weren't available or known about in those times, although if we really do a careful analysis of the labor movement 100 years ago, the strength of it was rooted in some very nonviolent tactics that work: boycott, strikes, sit-ins, shutdowns, cessation of operations, non-cooperation. All of these things are nonviolent tools. The violence that we think of as, kind of an identity marker of the labor struggle was really about the response to repression, the state and the corporate repression that went on. It wasn't actually the strategic driver of any of the successes of the labor movement from my perspective, but I'm partial to nonviolence. So I always like to let people really ponder what works and where the power shift occurs. We had Jeffrey Winters on the show a month ago talking about how our corporate work environments are actually much more dictatorial than anything we would consider putting up with in a political situation. And so I just think that's a very interesting angle on understanding this whole question of corporate personhood, that in giving our corporations rights, we're giving them not just, democratic rights, we're also allowing them to be tyrannical monsters in our workplaces and in our own political democracy. It's very corrosive, as I think you pointed out. I want to just ask you what you think about the role of people right now. What can they do right now to work on these issues?
I have a new chapter in the book, the new updated book, and it's called Do Something. So there's a lot that people can do. And the first thing I have to say, though, is, Rivera, I entirely agree with you that the nonviolent tools are the effective ones. Violence is not effective. It doesn't work. There's huge progress and work that can be done in a nonviolent way, and that's the effective way. So I essentially have three prongs that people can plug into where they think it works for them, and it's sort of around constitutional challenge, take back our Constitution, take back our rights. That's number one. Number two is what I kind of call clean the swamp. It's political change. It's lobbying reform. It's the public funding of elections. It's just calling out and demanding a change to things that are absolutely systemic corruption, that are just treated as if, by the media and politicians, as if it's just the way things are done. It shouldn't be the way things are done, and there's a lot of specific ways people can work on laws and organizing to change that. And then the third one is, I think, something like you were alluding to, just changing the corporation. It's remembering that corporations only exist under our laws. There's no right to have a corporation. There's no right to incorporate. It doesn't exist in nature. They're creations of state law, and we can change those laws. So there's things like B corporations, benefit corporations, where we change the laws, and about 20 states have done this to allow it. At some point, I think we should ask ourselves, why do we only just allow a good corporation? Why not say that's the only kind we're going to allow? We're not going to allow destructive, socially negative corporate models. So the B Corporation says essentially that it's not just whatever maximizes profit for the shareholder, that you have to take into account the employee interest, the environmental and societal interest, the community interest. The shareholder interest is one interest, but it's basically all the stakeholders. And there's about 1,000 benefit corporations now, including some big ones like Patagonia, my publisher, Barrett Kohler, and Ben & Jerry's, and others. So there's a lot of ways, and in the book I have specific groups and ways people can plug in online or otherwise to get involved in these different efforts. So I can go into more detail on any of them, but there's a lot that anyone and everyone can do.
We'll definitely have to put lots of links in our show notes to direct people to all that information. And it's always good to end on an up note on how we can correct these issues. But that is what we're going to have to do now, is we're going to have to end this conversation with Jeff Clements, who is the author of Corporations Are Not People and the co-founder of Free Speech for People. And Jeff, this has been like I said, a conversation that strikes right at the core of the Occupy movement, and I want to thank you for bringing your wisdom to this conversation, and give you one last chance if you have any specific points you want to be sure to make in the last minute or so that we've got you. The microphone's yours one last time.
Oh, well, thanks, Getch. And I want to thank you and Rivera and all the folks listening for what you're doing. I think this is exactly what we need to do, is share ideas and then get to work on it. And the Occupy movement has been a very important force. And I've been talking to folks around the country, including, I did a radio show last week on an extremely conservative show in Arizona. And there are people on all sides of the political spectrum who recognize we have to do this change, and that's whether through Occupy or other expressions of human beings taking back our rights and our democracy. It just inspires me, and I'm really grateful for all the people doing it.
That's great. You completely reminded me that, left or right, whatever your political viewpoint is, you are a human being. And corporations, despite what the Supreme Court say, are not people. Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the show, and it's been a total delight.
Thank you. Thank you both.
You can find out more about Jeff Clements and the fight against Citizens United at corporationsarenotpeople.com, where you can access the definitive guide to overturning Citizens United. You can also order the 2014 version of the book, Corporations Are Not People. You can find out even more about the fight against Citizens United at freespeechforthepeople.org. And finally, you can reach Jeff Clements' law offices at jeffclementsllc.com.
Occupy Radio is produced through KWVA 88.1 FM on the campus of the University of Oregon. Nathan Stevens is our producer, and we have support from OEMG, the Occupy Eugene Media Group.
Thanks to our guests this week, Jeff Clements and Johnny King Dangers, and thanks to my fully accredited nonviolence coordinating co-host, Rivera Sun.
Well, we love to hear from you, occupiers, so you can drop us a line at Occupy Radio 23 on Twitter and Gmail. We're Occupy Radio on Stitcher and iTunes, where you can give us a 5-star review if you feel really excited about these shows. You can find us on Facebook and chat with us on the Occupy Radio group page, and we are occupyradio.org.
For Occupy Radio, I'm David Getchy Sierralupe. The California Supreme Court threw out an advisory measure asking California voters if Congress should overturn the Citizens United ruling. Is the California Supreme Court in the corporate pocket, occupiers? Or will they maybe rush out an emergency opinion complete with new ballots so the people of California can enjoy the same free speech rights as corporations? by the time we talk to you next week.